Hello and welcome to the Genetics Podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Short. My background is in population genomics and studying the genetic causes of rare disease. I did my PhD at the Sanger Institute in the University of Cambridge and have been in biotech since 2018 when I started Sonogenetics. Sonogenetics helps academic and industry researchers to run large-scale genetic testing programs that speed up their clinical trials, generate data sets for the next big breakthrough, and give participants the best possible experience taking part in research. Each episode of the Genetics Podcast, we bring you insights from the leading minds in genetics and precision medicine, including household names and Nobel Prize winners, as well as early career scientists and biotechs working on the next big breakthrough. Whether you are a scientist, entrepreneur, executive, patient advocate, or simply someone curious about how genetics shapes our world, you're in the right place. Thank you for listening, and let's get started. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Genetics Podcast. I'm very excited to be here today with Max Bronstein, who's the founder and CEO of Aviva Strategies. They are a health policy firm that's really focused in on therapeutic development and supporting biotechs as well as large pharma, in particular in rare, ultra-rare, and precision medicine. I've been wanting to have this conversation with Max for a while after actually introduction from past podcast guest Sal Rico, because so much of what we do is influenced by policy. And we've had a ton of changes in the last couple of months that, depending on the week, really can be positive for rare disease patients, can be negative, and can just frankly be uncertain at times. So we're going to try to make some sense today around what the current what the current state of affairs is, what some of the big open questions are, and how it may go in the future. So Max, thanks for joining us.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks, Patrick.
I'd like to start with just a really open-ended question. So take it whatever direction you'd like. But we had a new administration in January. In the US, I'm speaking about, obviously. Lots has changed since then. There are still some big open questions, but also the dust is starting to settle a little bit. Appointments are being made. There are some major events happening within the administration with respect to new application approvals. I want to just get a sense from you of, based on your expectations of what might have happened and where we are today, what are the big things that have changed? And also, what are the big open questions that you're focused on right now that are going to have an impact on patients and on drug developers?
Thanks for the question. Yeah, so we've seen an enormous amount of change in the last 5 months of this new administration. And I think it's been pretty dizzying for companies and for patients who are trying to figure out, what is this going to mean for them? What is it going to mean for rare disease patients who are still waiting for treatment? On the corporate side, what is it going to mean for a small mid-cap bio who's going to have to raise money in this environment? What is it going to mean for a company who's trying to get from phase 1 to phase 2? Will they be able to do that in the US, or will they have to do that abroad? So there are some really big and at times probably overwhelming challenges here. We are starting to see some more structure take shape on the sort of reg front. We had to wait several months to really get a clear picture of who was going to be in the leadership at FDA. Like, that is actually still just starting to take shape again with the new head of CDER, the drug side of the agency, recently announced. So we're starting to see the team come into place there, and the commissioner has announced some priorities, but I think we can fully expect that there will be new priorities announced over the next 6 months going into the future. So there's some things to be optimistic about there, but I think fundamentally there are still major challenges at the FDA in terms of workforce, in terms of morale. We certainly know that there was a huge number of federal employees who left the agency. And when that happened, the agency lost a lot of institutional memory and expertise, which is very troubling if you're coming from the industry point of view, where we're looking at the pace of innovation that's happening, particularly on the biologics side of the equation. And it's incredible and inspiring, yet some of the people who have exactly that kind of training have now left the FDA, right? So it raises all of these questions about whether the FDA is not only going to be able to return these proposed studies in a timely way, but also have the right expertise in-house to know how to make sense of some of these new technologies that are coming down the pike. So long story short, it's an incredibly exciting time to be working in the field of biotech and public policy. There's an enormous amount at stake. I will share that I've been doing this for about 20 years. And earlier in my career, I used to spend a lot of airtime and in word count, basically explaining to people in biotech why they should care about what happens in Washington, D.C. Nowadays, it's so blatantly clear. One announcement comes out, and 2 days later, a quarter of a company's market cap is wiped out. So the connection between the decisions made in Washington, D.C. and what happens with the biotech industry has never been made more clear. And we're certainly seeing that on the patient side of the equation too, especially, when you think about therapeutic development, but also access to healthcare, access to health insurance. All of that is on the table right now.
Yeah, if we focus on new therapeutic development for a second, for people who aren't all that familiar with the process, could you go through the major ways that a biotech or pharma company actually interacts with the FDA, IND applications, BLAs, PDUFA dates? People hear these words, but maybe if you could just bring that to life and the chronology a little bit for people of what that looks like for a company and what those interactions entail. What are the companies bringing to the table? And what are they getting back from the FDA?
Yeah, so before any company will really go in to ask for an IND, investigational new drug meeting, where they're basically asking permission to start the clinical trial, they will do all kinds of pre-clin studies. Historically, those have been done in animals. That is changing in this new FDA. So you may have seen that the agency is running what's effectively a pilot program for monoclonal antibodies, where they are creating a pathway to get to IND without having to do animal studies first. Why are they focusing on this? Where is this coming from? There's been some pretty compelling data over time showing that results in animal studies often do not translate into humans. You've heard anecdotes and stories of diseases being cured in animals, and then you try to apply that same technology in humans, and it just does not pan out. So, I think there's perfectly good, valid scientific questions being raised. There's also a political component here, which is that our new Secretary of Health and Human Services loves animals. He is truly an animal lover at the end, end of the day. So, this is good politics for this administration, and it could turn out to be very good policy as well. So the beauty of doing this pilot program is, you run it for several years, do the analysis, and basically see if it's worth continuing. So, once a company gets through that IND stage, they can actually launch a clinical trial. There's a lot of public policy implications here too, because as you've probably seen, Patrick, companies are choosing very frequently to go abroad for clinical trials, especially phase one. So Australia has just become like the new hotspot for phase one clinical trials. And while I think that's very good for Australia and potentially for some patients there, this is not great news for the United States. And I say that because if we want to continue to be the sort of beating heart of the biomedical industry and lead the world in biomedical innovation, if we don't have clinical research going on in the US, we're not going to be able to maintain that lead. So this is something that should concern all of us in the industry, and really comes down to thinking about how the FDA can streamline, modernize. You can pick your descriptor word, but the FDA basically needs to catch up to its peers. So that is a big piece of the public policy discussion, is how can we modernize and streamline the agency, not only to provide speedy reviews, but also to remain competitive nationally as a leader in the biotechnology space. So that's something, we want to look out for. And then assuming we can keep phase one clinical trials in here, then we want to go to the subsequent phases. And, all of these reviews have very specific types of meetings that come with the agency. And the agency will give you feedback on protocol for clinical trial design. This is one of the things my own firm has been helping with, is we partner with companies and we help them think through how to engage patients during the drug development process and drug sort of clinical trial design process. What we've seen over time, this is a big cultural shift, is patients were effectively viewed as subjects in clinical trials, and that has changed dramatically in a good way. We now look at patients as partners and co-pilots who are helping companies think through some of the biggest challenges around drug development. So that could be that are endpoint design, thinking through biomarkers, thinking about endpoints that not only are acceptable from a regulatory point of view, but are actually improving quality of life for patients. This is something that we've seen in, I think, many different parts of drug development over time is, you have these old school biomarkers that have been qualified and verified, but they don't always actually track to improved outcomes for patients. So ideally, you want to be able to identify an endpoint, a metric that makes sense for patients and for regulators. So one of the ways you can surface that is by meeting with groups of patients who are directly affected by disease, understand what matters to them in a new product, what matters to them from a quality of life point of view. And then you partner with them to think about how to design a clinical trial that a company could actually recruit for. And you would be amazed, Patrick, some of these companies are spending enormous amounts of money. They're building a trial that is almost impossible to recruit for because the protocol is too onerous. It puts too much burden on patients. Maybe it requires them to travel a huge distance or collect specimens at inconvenient times of day. So yeah, being wise and engaging patients in the clinical trial design process is critical these days. So assuming you can get through all of those pieces of drug design and drug development, eventually you'll get a PDUFA date from the agency, which is a specific amount of time that they have to review a final package and provide permission to market a product in the US.
And so the length of that process, it obviously varies, but is often 8 to 10 years. The cost varies, but billions of dollars often to make it to the finish line. And you pointed out like there are a million ways to fail along the way. One of those being design a trial that's hard to recruit. One of them to pick a bad endpoint. One of them is to get to the very end of the process and have not actually judged the commercial market correctly. I'd love your perspective on how much of that is. I think there's a perception out there that, and part of the change, that part of the potentially positive changes at the FDA is removing some of the unnecessary regulatory burden. I think there's a narrative that a lot of the length and the cost of that process are things that companies shouldn't have to be doing, but they're made to do anyways. But I think the other side of that coin is companies often do this to themselves, right? There's nobody telling them to design an impossible trial, and they do it anyways because of some kind of internal decision making. I'd love to get your perspective on that, of how much is the system and the way it's been designed in this very unique way where you have a regulator that makes the final decision, and how much of it is the individual participants in the market making these decisions and blaming it on the regulator, for lack of a more diplomatic term.
Yeah, it's a very dynamic space, and the FDA is not as often as they should, but occasionally releasing guidance documents, guidance to industry, which are good and helpful recommendations to industry about what they can do to effectively meet the sort of milestones of a clinical development program. That's a very positive thing that the agency does. What's problematic is the agency is, like so many things they do, not well resourced to do new guidances. So what we often see is the guidance development typically lags technology development in the biotech sector.
Right.
So occasionally you'll get companies who are sort of the pathfinders in a new technological platform like prime editing, CRISPR, or some of these newer modalities that we're seeing. But they're kind of writing the rules as they go along, or building the plane as they fly it. So that requires a lot of early stage interaction with the agency. Earlier in my career, I was the chief policy officer at the Aviva Foundation for Rare Diseases. We helped pass a landmark piece of legislation called the 21st Century Cures Act. One of the provisions of that is a new designation at FDA, the RMAT designation, which stands for Regenerative Medicine Advanced Therapies designation. But that new pathway basically allows for products to have earlier, more frequent interactions with the agency. So those types of meetings are really important when you're using a somewhat novel platform that hasn't been sort of well tested, well established in humans. So, that's an example of a space where I think when you have that really tight interaction with the agency, you can get clear guideposts about where to go. This gets very complicated, though, in a time where perhaps the reviewers and the leadership that you've built your plan around are no longer at the agency. We've seen lots of anecdotes of this, a company has spent 6 months redesigning in responding to clinical trial protocol amendments, and then they look up and all of a sudden their division director is no longer at the agency, and the goalpost has shifted effectively. This is a place we never want to be in from an industry point of view or from a patient point of view, because in a lot of the disease space I work in, which is rare disease, ultra rare, a 6-month delay in a program, in 6 months, many children may die, many children may lose function permanently. So these are irreversible consequences for patients. So anytime the agency is sort of pushing back and changing the goalposts, they have to be really thoughtful about how to do that, and certainly balance that with the needs from the patient community.
Did this level of shakeup happen? I know you worked in the Biden administration for a little while. Did this happen between Obama and Trump 1 and between Trump 1 and Biden? Or is this what we're seeing now sort of unprecedented, the amount of changeover that there has been?
So I served as the assistant director for health innovation in the Biden White House, and was there for 2 years. And any time a new government comes in, particularly when the political party changes, you can expect disruptions in government. So some change and disruption is to be expected and very typical. The level of disruption and change is unprecedented in this administration. And this is not a political comment that I'm making. This is based
statistical
on data and information in terms of the number of personnel who've changed over, in terms of those folks departing, the new folks arriving. And so, that's a huge amount of change in a very short period of time for the government. And it's created this sort of dark cloud of uncertainty for the biotech industry, which is really troubling because, government can be a barrier to innovation in this space, or it can be a catalyst. And we want to do everything we can do to make sure that government is having an authentic partnership with industry in a way that is pro-patient and pro-innovation. So that's like, that the happy place we want to arrive to. I think we're starting to see some slivers of hope. And if you look at the FDA, for example, the commissioner just appointed a new head of CDER who does have an industry background. So having someone who's actually worked in industry tends to be very helpful from a regulatory perspective, because they understand very deeply the drug development process and what the barriers are to industry and to patients. So, that's encouraging. We've also seen the FDA announce a new voucher program, a national voucher program intended. I think the intent is largely to sort of onshore parts of the clinical development enterprise and create incentives for companies to do that. So those are things that I think can be meaningful over time. And there are a lot of geopolitical risks in the world today. So when you start onshoring drug development and drug manufacturing capability, you're doing it in such a way that biotech isn't just about creating jobs and making money, it's about national security. So that's another piece that historically has been overlooked, but in a post-COVID world, it's become extremely clear that we need this industry to be robust and a global leader in order to really ensure U.S. national security going forward.
What's the current status of the rare patient review voucher? This I think has not been renewed as of a few months ago, and this has been a big support to rare disease focused patient organizations, biotechs, anyone who's developing for rare and orphan indications. I'd love to get your perspective on where that is in moving back through the policy works, and also its value as well, because I think it's been underappreciated until it's gone away.
Yeah, totally agree with that. So let me back up for a sec. The Pediatric Priority Review Voucher Program is designed to provide an incentive for companies to undertake what is probably the riskiest form of drug development a company can do, rare and pediatric, really tough space, very high risk. It's also a key incentive in the development of ultra rare disease. So we don't have a clear definition in the US of what ultra rare is, but there are a lot of companies that are tackling ultra rare disease. And if it weren't for the PRV, the Priority Review Voucher Program, they would not be able to raise money for these disease areas that they want to tackle. I mean, we're talking about diseases that affect a couple hundred kids a year, and trying to run a business where we only have a very small patient pool is just not realistic and not pragmatic. The PRV program has literally made not only companies possible, but the treatments they make possible. And so very tragically and not very thoughtfully from a public policy point of view, when this program was established, it sunsets after 5 years. So every 5 years, it has to be reauthorized, which means we have to gin up the entire, biotech industry, the patient community. Everyone has to go out there, educate Congress on A, what this program is, and B, why it matters, and C, like what's at stake if we lose it. The pediatric cancer community and lots of other rare disease communities on the patient side have been speaking incredibly loudly about this piece of legislation. We were very close to getting it done at the end of last year. Did not happen because of a certain someone tweeting at the end of basically at the last minute. So unfortunately, this program is going to have to wait for another vehicle in Congress that it can leverage to actually pass. What I do know is that this program, not only is it incredibly important to the patient community, it is very important to Congress. The bill that has been introduced has hundreds of bipartisan and bicameral co-sponsors, meaning both House and Senate. So it's looked at very favorably in Congress. I think they're waiting to identify the right vehicle for this bill to hitch a ride on and pass. So I do believe it will ultimately get reauthorized. It is insanely frustrating to me that we have to make so much noise about a piece of legislation that is literally designed to save kids' lives. Not just every kid, like these are kids with some of the worst diseases you can imagine. And yet we're having to fight this hard just to get that. So that to me is quite frustrating as a public policy professional, because this should be square zero, and we should be moving on to some bigger picture issues around ultra rare disease development and other spaces that I think are really promising right now.
Is that because of this wacky way that we jam so many things into these huge bills? I just like asking the very simple question of, if this has so much support, why can't they just get it out there and vote on it and make it happen?
Yeah, unfortunately, Congress in the last decade has been in a mode of tending to only vote on larger pieces of legislation that are considered must pass pieces of legislation. So what often happens is they will take something that must pass, say there's a bill to increase the debt limit, otherwise the credit rating of the United States is going to crash overnight. So clearly that is a must pass piece of legislation. And then they'll do the sort of Christmas tree maneuver where you're throwing as many other bills to hitch a ride on that vehicle as you can. There are rules around germaneness that limit what you can throw into a larger, what's called an omnibus package. But that is how Congress has tended to operate. And it's not a smart way to do policymaking, because it basically means you're legislating around crises, many of which are self-made. Some of them, you're responding to a natural disaster, that's different. But a lot of these, like things like the debt limit and setting the budget for the government, these are fundamental parts of Congress's job, and they're struggling to even do that. So yeah, we're bracing for what is already being a very tough year from a sort of fiscal point of view when you look at funding for FDA, for NIH, for ARPA-H. So all of those things are at risk at the moment.
Is that a strategic thing where they don't want to be pinned down to, they have coverage where they can say, I voted for I voted for increasing the debt ceiling because we had to, and I didn't vote for this other thing? Or is it just how the negotiation has evolved that they, depending who's controlling it, that those omnibus bills are a way to make the negotiation around these more fringe things easier? I'm just really interested in why it's evolved to this very strange local maximum rather than something better.
Yeah, I mean, it's a way to force Congress to vote on something that's incredibly important. And it can be a way to basically require your political enemies to vote for something they otherwise would never vote for. So
Right.
You've probably heard of the term like poison pill, and that would be putting a highly controversial piece of legislation into a bigger legislative package that is relatively non-controversial. So we have seen that tactic used, and it would basically force one side to vote on an extremely hot button issue that normally they would not touch, but they are forced to by virtue of the fact that it's now in this much bigger bill. And if they don't pass this bill, the debt limit ceiling would be hit, for example, or an agency would shut down, or more likely the entire government would shut down, because those are the kinds of votes that Congress is being forced to make right now.
Yeah, that makes total sense. Going back to a different time or simpler time, you were involved in the creation of ARPA-H, where I'd love if you would talk a little about that, because I think it's relevant to this whole discussion as well, because it's a different form of creative destruction of how the government can do things, right? Instead of reforming, or in addition to reforming the existing institutions, you can also create new ones, inspired in this case by DARPA. And I found we haven't participated in any ARPA-H calls as a company before, but I've looked at a number of them, and there's some really ambitious big swings at major problems. So I'd love if you could talk a little bit about what the idea was there, your involvement in it, a little bit about what it's doing today.
Yeah. So I think ARPA-H is the most exciting thing the US government has done in the biotech space in decades. I really believe that. So for those who are neophytes to this, it's Advanced Research Projects Agency for Health. I always want to start by dispelling the acronym soup there, but the agency is modeled off of DARPA. And if you look back at some of the wins that DARPA has had over the years, I mean, DARPA is a very old agency now, but I mean, creating the internet, night vision, GPS, incredible breakthroughs have come from DARPA. And a lot of it comes from their model, the type of model where you have a program manager who is empowered to give typically pretty large awards to a research performer. And they're only giving awards out to people who have the capability and the vision to do something that's really transformative, in this case, in the space of health and healthcare. When you look at the framing of ARPA-H, long before President Trump was elected, we were actually framing the need for ARPA-H in the same way that Secretary Kennedy has been looking at the challenges facing the U.S. health system. We spend an enormous amount of money and resources, and we don't have very good outcomes relative to our peer countries. So that is one of the reasons why ARPA-H was invented. We have this incredible constellation of agencies in the federal government, but they tend to be pretty risk averse overall. And if you look at how peer review as a process works, it is very political at times, and it can be super risk averse. So if you have a breakthrough idea that is off the wall, but if it works, could be really game changing for patients, like that is probably not going to fare well in a system of peer review, standard peer review. So ARPA-H was designed to kind of break that mold in half in a good way. And it's designed very much to tackle some big picture challenges that are going on in the space right now. So my role when I was at the White House was to basically articulate the need for ARPA-H, explain why this mattered to other parts of government, whether it was folks who are already working in the biomedical space in government, because you can imagine that if you are a leader at any federal agency and all of a sudden the White House is saying we need a new federal agency that's going to play in a space that you have played in historically, that makes people nervous sometimes. So you had to explain to them that this was additive and it wasn't going to take away from what already exists. And then we had to make the case to Congress that was one of the most critical parts, because they were the ones who carry the checkbook, so to speak, and they have to authorize this thing to exist before it could get really properly funded. What's pretty incredible is when I started at the White House, ARPA-H was literally an idea on a piece of paper. That piece of paper happened to be a publication in Science magazine. But by the time I got out of there, we had over $1 billion in funding and a brand new agency set up with a director that was in place. So that's pretty fast to create a new agency. So I still feel very proud about that and good about that. And I will say, I was quite worried about how it would fare in the new administration. And it's actually fared relatively well compared to some of the other, we'll call them legacy health agencies, whether it's CDC or NIH. ARPA-H has actually done pretty well, all things considered. And we hope to continue for that to be the case. And I've been part of some advocacy efforts to to make sure that ARPA-H remains in good standing and that everyone understands the need and importance for this type of model and this type of health innovation.
And how does ARPA-H get funded? So it's through Congress? Does it have to just go back every year and they pitch for more? How does that work exactly?
Yeah, so every year the appropriators, who are specific members of Congress who get to decide funding levels for individual agencies, they decide the funding level for ARPA-H and for anything else that lives within the we'll call it the HHS ecosystem, the Health and Human Services ecosystem. So they get to set the funding number, but there's a lot of maneuvering that happens too. So people are going to meet with Congress appropriators ahead of time to talk about why they think whatever program needs to be a higher priority, and then it's ultimately up to Congress to decide how they weigh this within their other priorities, because each component of the appropriations committee, the appropriators, they have to live within a certain cap, and they can do increases, but they can't exceed the sort of global cap that is set for their committee. So yeah, there's a huge amount of political maneuvering that goes on there. At the end of the day, like I said, I think they have actually fared reasonably well, and we hope that will continue to be the case going forward.
Yeah, I think that you've got a little bit of a mantra of making sure that the policy you're advocating for fits with the politics of the day, right? Those two, you can't consider those two in isolation. Maybe you could talk a little bit more about that and how to be adaptive or agile to recognizing those two realities. They're two different things, but they're fundamentally intertwined in ways that you can't just ignore.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's been one of the biggest lessons of my 20-year career in public policy and public health is like the political environment is insanely dynamic, and with the advent of social media, it's more dynamic now than it once was. So you're constantly having to think about how to make sure that your policy agenda, whether it's creating a new agency or boosting up an existing program within NIH, how that policy fits the sort of political environment that it has to exist in. And if there is a disconnect there, that program or agency, whatever it is, probably will not survive. At least it won't be intact in the way that it once was. So, we saw a significant dismantling, for example, of DEI programs throughout the federal government. And, that was hugely disappointing to folks across agencies and folks, scientists, researchers who are working in those spaces. But that was a very clear example of how, when you don't reorient and change the sort of framing of a program, it can put it at risk. So yeah, that to me was like a pretty clear wake-up call of what is at stake if we don't adapt to the new political environment. And so, no one likes the idea of having to change a scientific program overnight, but a lot of the fundamentals of these programs could be altered to, I think, better fit the sort of political dynamic of the day and therefore keep them intact, which at the end of the day is something everyone can agree on, is continuing to basically properly resource science and make sure we have researchers who have all of the tools they need to succeed.
Yeah, how do you think about something like rare and ultra rare diseases and precision medicines, gene therapy, RNA, all of these kind of new tools that we have in the current political climate? What is the right way to frame those so that they're in line with the political objectives versus running the opposite direction?
Yeah. So I think we are living in one of the most incredible times to be in the environment of biotech and biotechnology and biopharma, because if you think about all of the new platforms that have been developed over the last decade, and if you look at the advent of AI coming in now, so you're going to see all of that innovation accelerate. So drug development is going to speed up, the number and type of platforms is going to speed up. Incredible amount of scientific progress is happening. When you apply the frame of ultra rare to this, we are getting very sophisticated at diagnosing disease. And a lot of that is because the cost of sequencing has come down. So we're going to see sequencing in other modalities better integrated into public health programs for newborn screening and other types of approaches. So what that means is we're going to be diagnosing these ultra rare diseases on a pretty routine basis going forward. And the future we want to avoid is one in which you get a diagnosis and there's no therapeutic for that patient. The future we want to run towards as fast as humanly possible is this future where we saw what happened with baby KJ, who was treated at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. I mean, an incredible story. So we got a sneak preview of what is possible when we read that case study of baby KJ, where you had a child born with a rare, devastating, life-threatening pediatric disease, and things continued to go well for this patient. He may never be sick even one day in his entire life, which is a complete sea change in medicine. So that is the future we want to run towards. And I want to be part of building a future in which every patient has that possibility, has that chance, that opportunity to not just be treated at birth, but like be treated with a disease modifying therapeutic, ideally a one and done medication, and set that person up on a trajectory for the healthiest possible life. So that's what is on the table right now. So that's why I'm so excited about everything that's going on in this space. The challenge comes around public policy, really, because like we have the science in a lot of places, but we need solid public policy in place to catalyze some of the innovation that needs to happen and the patient access. Because, what if there's a future where we have figured out how to create curative treatments for these diseases, but patients can't get them either because there's no clear reg path or because insurance companies are simply refusing to pay for them. So both of those are totally, human-made problems, and we can figure that out. So one of the projects I've been helping to lead is around designing legislation to incentivize drug development for ultra-rare disease, because I want to live in a future where when a baby is diagnosed with these diseases, we have an answer for them, and an answer that can come rapidly and before they even develop any symptoms of disease.
What new ideas or revitalization of old ideas do you think are going to be part of that? Like, what are the key things to make ultra rare and rare disease drug development more attractive?
Yeah, so we can look back at the passage of a law called the Orphan Drug Act, which was passed in 1983. So we're going back in time here, but in 1983. I think there were 12 drugs that were actually FDA approved for rare diseases, which is insane because there's an enormous amount of unmedical need in that space and an enormous amount of patient suffering that was happening. In 1983, Congress woke up to this dynamic and passed the Orphan Drug Act. What did it do? It created a definition for rare disease, which is 200,000 or fewer patients in the US. It created incentives around tax credits and waiving regulatory fees. And it wasn't an overnight change, but over time, the industry got really excited. And that industry also learned, I can't talk about this without talking about the importance of pricing, but industry realized that they could charge a premium price for rare disease therapeutics and that it was possible to make real profit in this space. And that catalyzed a huge amount of investment, which we started with this topic at the top of the podcast. Without that investment, like you can't get a program going. So we can do the same thing today. And it means creating a definition for ultra rare. It means creating incentives and a clear regulatory path to get these products through there, because, running a randomized clinical trial for a patient population of 100 patients globally, like probably not feasible for that disease state. So you need a flexible regulatory path. You need an incentive so that companies can at least get a shot at profitability if they can get something approved. And then you need patient partnerships as well to really design smart clinical trials and make sure that these products are actually getting out the door to patients.
We have been seeing a trend in rare disease over the last 4 or 5 years of more and more companies using real world evidence, external control arms, these statistically, mathematically driven approaches to reducing the number of patients that need to enroll in a clinical trial, especially in a placebo controlled arm, which we know is challenging or sometimes impossible in a rare disease trial just based on the nature of the intervention. But I'm curious to get your take on whether you see, I see two countervailing forces. One is we need to do more and more of that because of the nature of these populations, and the technology is supportive of that. But I also see, Vinay Prasad, for example, who has been pretty vocal about demanding more rigorous clinical trial data than we've perhaps seen in the past. So I'm curious to get your perspective on whether are those pulling in different directions, or is rare disease just different where he or people like him may look at that and go, I acknowledge that we can't have quite the same setup there that we might have in a medical device trial or another case where really we can and should be running more rigorous clinical trial setups.
Yeah. So when the new commissioner, Commissioner Macri, came into the leadership role at FDA, the first interview he did, literally in the first one, and he was asked, what is the FDA looking at doing in this new administration? And he, unsolicited, talked about the importance of creating a new type of pathway for rare, ultra rare, which created a lot of buzz and excitement in the patient community and within industry. We have yet to see what that will actually look like in terms of, what does this pathway look like? How does a company apply for it, or a sponsor get into that? So there's still a lot of open questions there. And we see and we hear really good rhetoric from the agency when it comes to rare and ultra rare. We do not always see that in practice when it comes to the review divisions. And this has been a long-standing challenge with the FDA, where we get really nice, lovely, gorgeous rhetoric from the leaders when we call podium policy. And then you talk to a company who's actually trying to make good on some of these promises for flexibility, and they get a very different story when they're interacting with the review divisions.
Right.
So, there is a real disconnect there between what leadership is saying and what review divisions are doing. There are instances where leadership has overruled review divisions, and that is not great politics internally at the agency. It does not do wonders for morale, as you can imagine. But that it does happen from time to time. And we have seen in the last 6 weeks, we have seen a large number of CRL letters issued from FDA, complete response letters, that basically put a halt to a sponsor's drug development program. And a lot of them have been in the ultra rare space. It's very concerning. It's very concerning because when these letters come out, like in most cases, you're talking a minimum multi-month delay, 6-month delay, sometimes longer. And if your company is working on treating an ultra rare fatal pediatric disease, one that's progressive, like, you're going to lose a lot of kids in that period of time. Yeah. So that type of engagement is troubling. So we really need to right the ship around that and make sure that, and hold FDA accountable for all this talk of flexibility. And there's ways they can actually do this. It's like through guidance development, by interacting more frequently with sponsors and really helping them think through what they see as clinical trial challenges, short of issuing a CRL letter, which obviously can be devastating to not only a company, but to the patient community too, who's really, desperate for new treatments and holding on hope for a better future.
Yeah. Max, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to share all this. I learned a ton from you. If people want to find you and learn more about what you do, your website's avivastrategies.com. I know they can email you and find more information there. Are there particular kinds of people? I know you want to probably hear from biotech and pharma that are working in rare and ultra rare disease. Anything else in particular that you're looking for from the audience?
Yeah, no, I always love to connect with patient orgs, and I sit on the board of the Undiagnosed Disease Network Foundation, so do a lot of work with the patient community, particularly those in the rare, ultra rare space, and have spent a lot of time connecting with patients who are trying to figure out how to navigate this journey, and many of whom are doing something incredibly heroic, which is going from parent to biotech CEO. In the future world that I talked about earlier, no parent should ever have to do something like that, because the industry will do it for them and they can focus on being parents. So yeah, always happy to talk with parents who are new to that space and trying to learn how to navigate the odyssey.
Amazing. Well, please reach out to Max if this resonates with you. And Max, thanks again for spending this time with us.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here, Patrick.
Thanks, everyone, as always, and we'll see you next time. That wraps up this week's episode of the Genetics Podcast. I'd like to give a huge thank you to our guests for sharing their valuable insights and experience. And thank you as well to our listeners, as always, for tuning in. If you enjoyed today's talk, the number one thing I would really appreciate from you is if you could share it with a friend or colleague who you think would enjoy it as well. We would also really appreciate if you could subscribe to our show and give us a quick rate and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform. Both of these things help us become more visible when people search for genetics and precision medicine podcasts. And we're always eager to hear from you. Please reach out to us with any questions or feedback on social media. You can find Sanogenetics on Twitter, LinkedIn, or visit sanogenetics.com. Finally, a big thank you to the team behind the scenes who make all this possible, in particular Amy Cousins and Sonia Shah, who produced the show, and James Pierce from Selective Frequencies, who handles the audio engineering. I'm Patrick Short, your host, and it's been a pleasure. Thank you, and we'll see you next time on the Genetics Podcast.